The line shot out across the mess hall, making several heads turn. Corporal Reed stood in front of the table, one hand braced against the chair, as if he'd just delivered the funniest remark of the day. Behind him, 3 young Marines burst into laughter, their eyes filled with mockery. They stared at the quiet woman eating alone a simple red flight jacket. No flashy patches, no hint of bravado, just an unfamiliar face on base. Reed lowered his voice, just enough for his buddies to hear. "Looks like the pilot's wife got lost, huh?" He stepped closer, deliberately, closing the distance, trying to seize the higher ground. His smile wasn't friendly. It was the kind meant to place someone beneath his feet. "So what's your call sign?" His tone carried a forced confidence, the kind of challenge disguised as a joke only he thought was clever. The woman lifted her head. Her eyes were calm, unnervingly calm. No defensiveness, no embarrassment. No need to explain herself. She spoke slowly, clearly, each word placed down with the weight of steel Black Mamba. The laughter behind him stopped instantly. Reed froze, the smile slipping off his face. The whole group exchanged confused glances. They had no idea what they had just stepped into. No one understood that the name wasn't a punchline. It was a warning. A name that to those who knew it demanded immediate respect. If you believe true courage isn't found in the sound of gunfire, but in the quiet dignity of those who have lived through war, please subscribe to Veterans Legacy Stories and help us preserve the memory, honor, and reverence for our silent heroes. Reed forced a strained smile, the kind someone makes when they tell a joke that lands flat. He shrugged at his buddies, trying to hide the flicker of unease in his eyes. "She's probably just trying to spook us," he muttered, as if reassuring himself that the words Black Mamba were nothing more than a prank from a woman who happened to wander into the wrong military mess hall. But Arya Lane's composure was nothing like a joke. She quietly continued cutting her piece of chicken, as if there was nothing worth reacting to. That silence, that unshaken calm, made Reed uncomfortable. Her self-control made him feel his position in front of his friends wobble, as if he were facing not a random woman, but someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Reed squinted at the patches on her red flight jacket. "VM Fat 101. That's a Hornet Training Squadron patch." He spoke loudly enough for the neighboring table to hear. "I used to work the flight line. That thing belongs to an actual pilot." He leaned in, lowering himself to inspect the details more closely. "WTI. You know what WTI is, right? Weapons and Tactics Instructor. Not everyone gets into that school." His voice sharpened, sounding like someone trying to force reality to match his own assumptions. He continued studying the faded sand-colored patch on her left sleeve. Even a deployment patch. None of this adds up. Reed crossed his arms, lifting his chin in challenge. "And you expect me to believe you're a Hornet pilot, ma'am?" Arya lifted her eyes for the second time. The air around her stayed as still as before. "Yes," she replied. One word. No raised voice. No extra explanation. That single word only fueled Reed's irritation. He expected her to react, to get flustered, defensive, maybe angry, anything that would reaffirm his sense of superiority. But Arya didn't give him that satisfaction. She didn't flinch. She didn't avert her gaze. She didn't retreat. Her calm was a wall Reed couldn't break through, and like any young Marine whose ego outruns his discipline, he began to lose control. Reed leaned even closer. "You really want me to believe you fly a Hornet?" "An FA-18 Hornet. That thing isn't a city bus." His tone turned sharp, as if trying to tear through her composure. Arya answered in the same steady voice as before. "I'm well aware it's not a bus." The absence of any tremor in her response hit Reed like a chokehold. He stepped back half a pace, then forward again, as if reclaiming lost ground. His pride couldn't accept the idea that someone he believed to be impossible as a pilot might actually be above him in every way. A few older Marines nearby had begun paying attention. A staff sergeant set down his tray, eyes heavy with the look of someone who had seen this scene play out too many times. A young corporal digging the hole he would soon fall into. A gunnery sergeant quietly folded his arms, his gaze shifting from Reed to the woman in the red flight jacket, then back to Reed, one cautious, measuring sweep. Reed wasn't done. When a young man wants to prove himself right at all costs, he rarely sees the cliff edge under his own boots. He inhaled sharply and jabbed a finger at the squadron logo on Arya's shoulder. "You get these patches from the PX, or someone give them to you as souvenirs." His voice grew louder, harder, as if trying to draw every eye toward him, to drown out the unease swelling in his chest. Arya set down her fork. She looked straight at him, unblinking. "No one gave them to me," she said. her voice calm as if stating the simplest truth in the world. I served with them. One sentence, but strong enough to make Reed stiffen. The young Marines behind him swallowed hard. Something in her tone and the way she didn't boast, didn't defend, simply stated fact made them feel they had stepped into something far more serious than they realized. Silence stretched for several seconds. Reed shifted his stance, his hands curling into small fists, as if clinging to the last remnants of his perceived authority. But the quieter Arya became, the more impatient he grew. His threatened ego pushed him in only one direction: more force, more pressure, more noise. In the corners of the room, the veteran Marines watching him understood what Reed didn't. He had lost control of himself, and the situation was past the point of return. They knew this wouldn't end well. And in the very moment Reed was about to take one more disastrous step, that silence was about to thrust him straight into a humiliation he never saw coming. Reed folded his arms, exhaling sharply through his nose as if he had endured enough of Arya's short, calm answers. He lifted his chin, speaking louder than necessary. All right? If you're really a pilot, show me your ID. CAC card. If you don't have it, then stop talking. The young Marines behind him went silent. A few glanced at one another, eyes flickering between anticipation and that reckless curiosity only youth can muster. Either she would panic and explain herself, or Reed would expose yet another woman who dared to challenge his ego. Arya said nothing. She didn't sigh. She didn't protest. She simply reached into the pocket on the side of her worn red flight suit and pulled out a soft, faded wallet, the kind that had been used for years. Her movements were slow, deliberate, the movements of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. She drew out her TAC card and set it lightly on the edge of the table so Reed could see clearly. Officer 04, Major, Arya Lane. A name, a rank, a classification, nothing to debate. Reed stared at the card. His eyes trembled for the briefest moment, a movement only someone standing very close could notice. But almost immediately, wounded pride pulled him upright like a taut wire. He blurted out the same line many young Marines use when they're trying to salvage their pride. This card could be fake. A soft murmur rippled through the mess hall. A few seasoned Marines set their trays down harder than usual. Not because they believed Arya or Reed, but because they had heard that same line too many times from people unwilling to look truth in the eye. Reed still wasn't done. He leaned forward, pointing at the WTI patch on Arya's left chest, a patch anyone in the Marine aviation community would recognize instantly. And this one, Reed sneered. WTI. You know what WTI is, weapons and tactics instructor? Only the best, the elite, make it through that course. You don't just stick that on for fun. You're mocking the honor of an entire community. He didn't say the words stolen valor, but the accusation was woven into every syllable he spoke. It fell between them like a dull blade being driven straight down. Arya looked at him, not flinching, not brushing his hand away, not reacting the way he desperately wanted her to. She said only one sentence, soft as breath, but sharp enough to rattle him. I earned it. I didn't take it. If Reed had been more experienced, he would have stopped there. But youth, rank, and pride pushed him another step toward the edge. Do you understand how serious this impersonation is? His voice was now louder than normal. You're on a Marine Corps installation, wearing a flight jacket with Hornet Squadron patches, and you're presenting a CAC card with a major's rank. If this is fake, you could go to prison. Arya kept her posture straight, one hand resting lightly on the table as if listening to a lecture unrelated to her. No one knew what she was thinking, but her stillness only made Reed more agitated. At a distant table, Master Gunnery Sergeant Rourke, the gray-haired Marine whose eyes had seen far too many of the mistakes made by young men, had stopped chewing long ago. He looked at the red flight jacket, at the VMFAT 101 patch, at the WTI patch, at the old deployment tour patch worn enough that only someone who had truly served would recognize it. Then he looked at the name Lane. A cold line ran down Rourke's spine. He slowly placed his coffee cup down. His eyes widened, not in surprise, but in recognition of something Reed had absolutely no grasp of. This combination of patches wasn't a good pilot. It was a warning to anyone seasoned enough to read it. Rourke whispered under his breath. No way. Lane, is it really her? He stood up carefully, as if afraid to disturb a sleeping memory stitched into that jacket. A heavy growing worry settled in his chest. Because if the woman sitting there truly was Lane, then Reed wasn't just about to make a mistake. He was about to collide headfirst with a woman on whose name the entire Marine aviation community spoke with equal parts respect and fear. And just as Rourke realized the truth, Reed's next move would make the entire mess hall hold its breath. The moment Reed's finger touched the WTI patch on Arya's chest, A surge of memory rose in her like instinct. Not a pleasant memory, not the loud kind of pride people brag about, but the kind only survivors understand, the cold silence that exists on the edge between life and death. For an instant, Arya heard again the familiar vibration of an FA-18's airframe taking a burst of anti-aircraft fire. That vibration was like a warning drilled into bone, signaling that the aircraft was no longer a steel warfighter, but a gravely wounded beast fighting against the pull of the sky. She remembered the strangled voice on the radio, Viper 1-1, we're pinned. Enemy fire is too heavy. Black Mamba, do you copy? It wasn't the usual call for support. It was the sound of recon Marines watching death walk toward them 1 second at a time. She saw her younger hands gripping the control stick, hunting for a gap in the dense wall of enemy fire. No one ordered her to dive in. No rule required a pilot to throw themselves into the kill zone just to save 3 trapped Marines. But Arya did. No hesitation. No calculation. She dropped altitude, adjusted her angle, and drove straight into the landing zone, where enemy gunners were locking onto the recon team. In that moment, she had one mission: carve a path wide enough for those Marines to escape the kill box. The ripping sound of bullets tearing through the air, the fire warning lights bleeding red across the cockpit, the acrid smell of burned plastic and overheated circuitry. All of it converged into a moment no one wants to remember, but no one who survives can ever forget. Then the image dissolved like a lightning flash that vanished as quickly as it appeared. Arya was back at the cafeteria table where Reed still stood in front of her chest, heaving with indignation. She looked exactly as she had a second earlier, calm, quiet, not a crack in her expression. No one saw the memory that had just passed through her mind. No one but her. And for someone who had once flown a wounded hornet out of hell, Reed's accusation of stolen valor was nothing but an empty echo, incapable of carrying the weight of her real life in uniform. At a distant table, Master Gunnery Sergeant Rourke could no longer stay seated. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts, while his eyes never left Arya. He spoke quietly, urgency, contained but unmistakable. Sir, I think the pilot they call Black Mamba is here. There was a pause on the other end. Not because the line was unclear, but because that name, Black Mamba, was the kind that made any officer who had ever read combat reports fall silent. Then Colonel Harlow's voice came through, stripped of irritation, stripped of calm. Master Guns. Are you certain? Rourke swallowed. Yes, sir. I looked at the patches. The name. The way she reacts. I can't be mistaken. Harlow's chair slammed backward as he stood too quickly. He needed no further explanation, no follow-up questions, no additional confirmation. The name Arya Lane was not the name of an ordinary pilot. It was a name found in combat reports so heavy that those who read them often sat in silence afterward. Master Guns Rourke lowered the phone, exhaling slowly, as his gaze drifted toward Reed, the young Marine pushing a woman he did not understand in the slightest. Rourke's eyes narrowed, a cold shiver running down his spine. He knew that within minutes, the fragile calm of this mess hall would shatter, and Reed would soon stand face to face with something he was never prepared to confront: the truth. And as Colonel Harlow began pulling up Arya Lane's file, the truth was about to hit with more weight than any accusation Reed had ever thrown at her. Inside his office, Colonel Harlow nearly tore the file open the moment it reached his hands. The black and white lines jumped out at him, one entry at a time, each so stark that he had to pause just to make sure he was reading them correctly. 2 847 flight hours. Not a number every pilot has. It was the mark of thousands of days and nights in a cockpit where every hour was paid for with strength, skill, and sometimes a piece of one's life. 612 combat hours. A number that would make any aviation officer fall silent. Every combat hour is a chapter written at the edge of mortality. She wasn't just a pilot. She was someone who had survived places most would never dare to imagine. Weapons and tactics instructor. Harlow frowned. This wasn't a regular qualification. It was a title reserved for the most elite aviators in the Marine Corps, those skilled enough to teach the next generation how to stay alive in the sky. Distinguished Flying Cross. Harlow rested his hand over the medal listed in the file. This was an award given only for extraordinary achievement far beyond duty. Arya Lane's name beside it was confirmation of what he had only heard whispered in special briefings. And finally, the line that made him stand up in an instant: combat call sign Black Mamba. Not a casual nickname. Not a name someone picked for fun. It was a symbol tied to missions that many recon teams still called the final miracle before despair. Harlow grabbed his phone and dialed the wing commander without a second thought. When the line connected, he spoke directly, his voice low and tight as steel wire. We have a respect emergency at the mess hall. On the other end, there were no questions, no excessive surprise. Only a short, heavy response, "I'm on my way." Meanwhile, at the Area 22 mess hall, Reed was becoming more aggressive precisely because he had no idea who he was dealing with. He held tightly onto Arya's KC card as though it were the one piece of evidence that could help him win against the woman before him. Reed's voice echoed loudly enough for the entire hall to hear. "You think a card like this is enough to fool me? You're coming with me to the Provost Marshal. Refuse, and you're breaking the law." His buddies immediately stood up, shifting to both sides, blocking Arya's exit. Their quick, sharp movement turned the space in front of her into a trap, narrow, but filled with threat. She didn't stand. She didn't protest. She simply looked at them, a look, without fear, without anger, but with a calm that made more than a few Marines shiver. Even the faint clatter of utensils died out. The entire mess hall fell silent. A staff sergeant murmured to the Marine beside him, "That kid's out of his mind. He's stepping into something he doesn't understand at all." An older gunnery sergeant rose to his feet, folding his arms, as he stared toward Arya, his expression wary, like a man bracing for a storm he knew would flatten anyone unprepared. No one said another word. Even breathing seemed to slow. Reed mistook the silence as a sign that the room agreed with him. He patted the pocket where he held Arya's ID and barked, "You're leaving. Now. I won't repeat myself." Arya looked at him, her eyes steady and unmoving. And in that very moment, the mess hall doors swung open with a decisive force, turning every head toward the entrance. What came next would bring everything to an end in a single drawn-out moment that would feel like a lifetime for Reed. The mess hall doors burst open with a decisive force that sliced every sound in the room clean in half. No one spoke, but every pair of eyes pivoted toward the entrance where 5 figures in uniform were walking in. At the front was Colonel Harlow, his face tightened by anger, suppressed only by his sense of duty. Right behind him was Sergeant Major Fulton, a man whose thick ribbon rack carried decades of battlefields. Beside them walked Brigadier General Monroe, the one-star commander of the entire Miramar Air Wing, a man whose very name made young Marines straighten their backs. Following them was Master Guns Rourke, his expression no longer stern, but sharpened with the certainty of someone who fully understood the gravity of the moment. And finally, a female lieutenant colonel from the staff, her eyes keen, as if assessing every small shift in the room. They said nothing, no shouting, no hurried steps. But each footfall made the air grow heavier. Food trays froze mid-air. A Marine in line stopped halfway through, picking up a spoon. A group of junior Marines fell silent, eyes wide as if watching something impossible unfold. The room was full, yet there was only one sensation left, the presence of absolute authority. Reed stood paralyzed, color drained from his face as if all the air had been ripped from his lungs. The hand holding Arya's key AC card trembled, then tightened as if gripping the last thing, keeping him from collapsing under the rising flood of fear. Colonel Harlow walked straight to Arya's table. He looked at no one else. He didn't acknowledge Reed, didn't glance at the young Marines blocking her path, didn't pay attention to the dozens of eyes fixed on him. He stopped exactly 2 steps in front of Arya Lane. He snapped his heels together, straightened, and raised his hand in a crisp salute. "Major Lane, ma'am, welcome to Miramar." The sentence hit the room like an electric shock. No one breathed for several seconds. Reed heard every word as if they were spoken directly into his ear. "Major Lane." "Ma'am." A Marine Corps colonel was saluting the woman he had insisted was a fraud. His knees weakened. His whole body threatened to collapse, but he forced himself to stay upright because his friends behind him were already shaking. General Monroe stepped forward. He cast a single glance at Reed, one glance that made a young corporal feel smaller than dust. Then he addressed the entire room, his voice low and resonant. "It seems someone here still questions Major Lane's qualifications." No one answered. No one dared. The general fixed his gaze on Reed, his tone steady but cold as steel. "Let me remind you who she is." He spoke each word clearly, ensuring the entire mess hall heard every syllable. "She has over 2,800 flight hours, over 600 combat hours. She is a weapons and tactics instructor, one of the most elite pilots in the United States Marine Corps. She wears the Distinguished Flying Cross for bringing a severely damaged Hornet across 80 nautical miles of red zone, preserving both her life and a vital asset of this nation, and her combat call sign." He paused, eyes locked on Reed. "Is Black Mamba." Someone swallowed the sound so small, yet everyone heard it. A few older Marines lowered their heads slightly, as though hearing the name of a legend. And Reed, it was as if something struck him square in the chest. His hand dropped helplessly, The CAC card nearly slipped through his fingers. General Monroe continued, "Black Mamba is not a bar story. It is a name given by a recon team that survived because of the precision of her fire." Every sound in the room vanished once more. Reed looked at Arya, and for the first time in this entire confrontation, he didn't see an ordinary woman, didn't see someone out of place, didn't see silence worth mocking. He saw a real officer, someone who carried life and death moments he couldn't begin to imagine. And as Arya opened her mouth to speak, the greatest lesson of Reed's life was about to reveal itself. The Miramar mess hall had gone so silent that even a single breath sounded sharp. The name Black Mamba, spoken moments earlier by General Monroe, didn't just crush Reed's arrogance, it drained the entire room of sound. Everyone present understood they were standing before an officer who carried chapters of combat that most of them would never come close to in their entire lives. General Monroe scanned the room, his gaze moving over the tense faces. He spoke in a steady voice, sharp as an oath. "This is one of the pilots who has saved more Marines than any of you here can begin to imagine. Remember that before you think you have the right to question someone else." No one answered. No one moved. No one dared meet Arya Lane's eyes. Reed stood across from her, his hands stiff as stone. His face had gone so pale that the faint blue veins under his skin were visible. He opened his mouth to speak, but his throat clenched tight, refusing to let sound out. He wasn't afraid of Arya, he was afraid of the truth now laid bare, that he had misjudged an officer, and worse, he had misjudged a human being. At that moment, Sergeant Major Fulton stepped forward. He didn't shout. He didn't snarl. He simply closed the distance until Reed could feel his breath. Fulton's gaze hit him with the weight of a sledgehammer. "You didn't see a Marine officer." He paused half a beat. "You saw a woman. And that is your failure." The words fell like a verdict that required no defense. Reed blinked rapidly, shame rising so fiercely in his chest he could hardly breathe. He swallowed hard and finally managed to speak, his voice trembling, stripped of every ounce of pride. "Ma'am. Major. I'm sorry. No excuses. No shifting blame. Just the raw apology of someone suddenly forced to confront his own ignorance." Colonel Harlow stepped forward, maintaining the rigid bearing of a senior officer. He turned to Arya Lane, his voice low but uncompromising. "Major, this Marine's behavior is unacceptable. If you wish to pursue charges under Article 134, the base will proceed immediately." Even the older Marines in the room stiffened at those words. An officer of Arya's rank had the full right to put Reed through a disciplinary process that could end his military career, and no one present would fault her for choosing that route. Arya looked at Reed. There was no anger in her eyes, no desire for revenge. Only the gaze of someone who had seen far more than any of them could understand. Her voice came soft, yet sharp enough to cut clean. "The standard protects all of us. Don't ever apply it differently." It wasn't mercy for Reed, and it wasn't easy forgiveness. It was a warning, a reminder of what has kept Marines standing strong across generations. The standard must be the same for everyone regardless of gender, age, or appearance. The room took that sentence like a blow to its collective pride. Young Marines looked down at their boots, realizing they had just received a lesson no training manual had ever taught. Older NCOs nodded subtly, recognizing that Arya had done exactly what true officers do, correct through dignity, not power. Reed bowed his head, his shoulders shaking slightly, as though he had just walked through something far heavier than he was built to bear. He didn't raise his eyes. He didn't look at anyone. But in the silence, everyone could see it. Reed was changing. For the first time that afternoon, he learned something no schoolhouse had ever covered. Respect isn't a reaction. It's a character. Arya Lane gently retrieved her key AC card from Colonel Harlow's hand. She didn't look toward the young Marines, but the calm on her face made it clear she carried no resentment with her. She laid her hand briefly over her WTI patch, as if reminding herself that what she had done, what she had survived, needed no one's validation. And from the moment Arya stood up from that table, this incident began its transformation into a legacy, a story the entire Miramar base would speak of for months to come. The story of that afternoon in the Area 22 mess hall spread faster than any official report. No one knew who told it first, but the name Black Mamba began appearing in duty rooms and chow lines and during late afternoon training sessions. Each person added a small detail, but two things never changed the calm of Major Arya Lane and the fall of a young corporal whose pride had gone in the wrong direction. Miramar Base didn't treat it as a mere incident. It became an official lesson. Less than a week later, an updated SOP was released. Its lines were short. Direct ID checks must be conducted with respect. No judging a service member based on gender, age, or appearance. Any degradation of respect must be reported immediately. These instructions weren't written to protect Arya Lane. They were written to protect the spirit of the Marine Corps, the very thing that has kept those in uniform standing firm for over 2 centuries. Reed was not removed from the military. Discipline was reviewed, reports were filed, but Colonel Harlow and Sergeant Major Fulton both understood. Sometimes the deepest lesson isn't punishment. It is shame strong enough to change a person. And Reed did change. He was no longer the loud young corporal who always wanted to show he knew more than others. He grew quieter, more observant, more careful before speaking. During training sessions, he often stood at the back, not out of fear, but because he had learned that humility is where true growth begins. A month passed. One clear weekend afternoon, with a gentle breeze blowing, Arya stepped out of the PX, holding a small bag of simple items. She didn't notice who was nearby until she heard a hesitant voice. "Major Lane, may I have a moment?" Arya turned. Reed stood there, not in uniform, but in simple civilian clothes. His posture was straight, but his eyes revealed his uneasiness. He inhaled deeply and spoke, "Ma'am, I want to apologize again. This time not because I was told to, not because anyone is watching, but because I am truly, truly ashamed of what I did." Arya didn't answer immediately. She let him finish. Reed continued, his voice cracking slightly. "I read your file. I read your DFC citation. I read what the recon team wrote about you. I can't even imagine. And I behaved like someone unworthy of wearing this uniform." There was a brief silence. Only footsteps from Marines passing the base gate could be heard. Arya looked at Reed. No anger, no coldness. Only the gaze of someone who had seen many young Marines stumble and had learned how to guide them back onto the right path. She spoke, her voice soft but firm. "Learn from it, Corporal. That's how Marines grow." Reed lowered his head. Not because he was scolded, but because he had been forgiven in the strictest, most honorable way possible, forgiven through responsibility, not emotions. Arya walked away, her steps light yet purposeful. She did not carry the incident as a wound or a point of pride. She left it with Miramar as a memory the base needed in order to grow. The next day, Arya returned to the training room, where she was writing a new syllabus for young pilots. She reread the first line she had written. "Precision is not a skill. It is a discipline." Precision wasn't only for the skies, it was for the way a Marine treated fellow Marines. And so the legacy of Black Mamba continued, not through combat legends, but through the quiet lessons of dignity, respect, and the silent courage of those who have lived through war. If this story makes you believe that honor and kindness never retire, please, share this video and subscribe to Veterans Legacy Stories so that none of their memories are ever forgotten.